What if the oldest words ever written by humans weren't meant to describe the start, but to caution us about the end? What if the earliest civilization wasn't actually first, but rather the final remnants of something much more ancient? Under the scorching deserts of southern Iraq, where the skyline shimmers like an age-old illusion, pieces of clay speak of an era the world has forgotten. Every wedge-shaped impression made by hands dead for 5,000 years still resonates faintly with intention, as if attempting to keep not merely words alive, but recollection itself. Before we venture too deeply into these remains, pause to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're attracted to the type of history that rests between legend and science. And if you're still watching, drop a comment sharing where you're watching from and what time it is. I'd love to picture this tale spreading across different time zones, gently accompanying you toward rest. Our tale starts not with solutions, but with particles. During the late 1800s, archaeologists excavating near Uruk and Eridu discovered thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. They anticipated primitive starts, uncertain scratches, experimentation and mistakes, the gradual emergence of human creation. Instead, what they uncovered was a civilization that seemed already developed. Mathematical frameworks, planned city layouts, laws composed in flawless structure, and documentation of celestial bodies mapped with remarkable accuracy. The Sumerians had entered history as though emerging from the remains of something more ancient. There was no steady development, no gradual progression from stone tools to bronze implements. The earliest Sumerian settlements, Eridu, Ur, Nippur, weren't disorganized communities. They were structured, astronomically oriented, and constructed with water management systems that challenged their supposed era. Their tongue emerged completely with no identified parent language, a linguistic orphan, as though it had been transported from elsewhere and placed down whole. History favors gradual advancement, one instrument leading to another. But Sumer disrupted that pattern. Its accuracy suggested recollection, not creation. Researchers have struggled with this for more than 100 years. How could the earliest civilization start incomplete development? How could a people without written predecessors suddenly create star maps matching contemporary findings, employ base, 60 mathematics still shaping our timepieces today, and construct temples oriented to heavenly occurrences? The further excavations proceeded, the more peculiar things became. The Sumerians themselves provided an explanation that troubles us even today. They recorded that leadership, understanding, and structure came from elsewhere. They didn't claim to create civilization, only to rebuild it. One tablet discovered in Berlin bears an unsettling inscription. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration, a term that transforms everything. If the Sumerians were reconstructing, what precisely had been erased? And what did they understand about the world before the Great Deluge? Picture holding one of those tablets right now, the clay still retaining warmth in your hand, its wedge-shaped marks carrying the rhythm of a hand that existed before every kingdom we recognize. Sometimes, when you examine these objects closely, you discover fingerprints pressed into the clay before it hardens. The print of a writer who perhaps existed 6,000 years ago, a heartbeat preserved in mud. And if you follow that ridge with your gaze, you understand those hands might have been recording the final surviving pieces of an age wiped away by deluge, time, or maybe deliberate choice. Through those marks, they documented not merely commerce and levies, but healing practices, celestial science, and songs. One tablet from Nippur records Venus's 584-day pattern, an achievement verified only with contemporary telescopes. Another describes Jupiter's and Mars's trajectories. Others hold mathematical equations predating Pythagoras by 1,500 years. Objects reveal comparable oddities. Bronze implements appear hundreds of years before the Bronze Era. Cylindrical stamps show mechanical apparatus. And then there's the curious item called the Baghdad battery, which might have produced electricity 2,000 years before its era. And then there are the accounts. The Sumerians described a massive flood that destroyed an earlier existence. The identical account surfaces in Akkadian writings, in various ancient texts, even in Mesoamerican books. Peoples separated by seas, by ranges, by thousands of years, all retaining the same disaster. How could they all preserve the same recollection? Maybe memory itself drifts like sediment, settling wherever awareness finds space. Or maybe the ancients shared more than we permit ourselves to consider. When archaeologists revealed Uruk's remains, they anticipated crude starts. Instead, they discovered city barriers extending 6 miles, grand temples oriented with heavenly points, and beneath one ziggurat, a collection of over 40,000 clay tablets. A civilization that recorded itself in remarkable detail, yet gave us more mysteries than solutions. How did they acquire so much so rapidly? Where did their mathematics, founded on 60, not 10, originate? Why did they chart the skies with such ease, as though they were recalling rather than finding? Some investigators propose that Sumer arose from hundreds of years of forgotten growth, small communities erased by weathering and flooding. Others suggest that the Sumerians received their understanding from an even earlier people, one eliminated by the disasters that concluded the last ice epoch. And then there are those who interpret the tablets literally, that advanced beings who came from elsewhere were not mythical in the spiritual meaning, but instructors, voyagers, or maybe survivors of a civilization that came before us completely. But even the doubters confess something unusual. The Sumerian chronology doesn't match expectations. Civilizations aren't meant to appear completely organized. Yet here they did. Farming, writing, law, melody, medicine, all simultaneously. The clay tablets don't reveal experimentation and mistakes. They reveal sophistication, as though what we term the origin of civilization was to them a reconstruction. In the Museum of the Ancient Near East in Berlin, a small clay cylinder sits behind protective glass. The inscriptions on its face describe constructing a temple. But among the dedication phrases, one sentence is notable. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration, a term that suggests recollection, not creation. It's a quiet acknowledgement that even the Sumerians viewed themselves as inheritors of something more ancient. Sometimes when you look closely at these objects, you discover fingerprints pressed into the clay before it hardens, the print of a writer who perhaps existed 6,000 years ago. And if you follow that ridge with your gaze, you understand those hands might have recorded the final surviving pieces of an age wiped away by deluge, time, or maybe deliberate choice. The quietness between those phrases feels weighty, as if something immense had been removed. The same way an absent note can linger in an entire melody, the same way an erased memory hovers at the border of slumber. Maybe that's why these accounts still speak to us. They remind us that what we call history might only be the portion that endured the destruction. At night time, when the museum's shut and the illumination dims, I picture those clay tablets breathing in the shadows, each one holding the dim recollection of a world we no longer know. We believe we are the start of comprehension, but maybe we are the final chapter of remembrance. And as the desert breeze passes over Uruk's remains, carrying particles of ancient powder into another 1,000 years, you can nearly hear the opening phrase of our forgotten tale, gentle, incomplete, waiting to be heard once more. If the Sumerians were not the first, then whom were they recalling? They stated, leadership came from elsewhere, not figuratively, not symbolically, but as a declaration of truth recorded in clay more than 4,000 years ago, a phrase that still trembles with something language struggles to hold. After the leadership came, leadership was in Eridu. It is the beginning verse of what we now term the Sumerian king list, a record of monarchs whose reigns extend far beyond the limits of human capability. But before we can comprehend who those impossible monarchs were, we must first examine what they left behind, because the clay tablets are only part of the account. The settlements themselves speak just as powerfully. The earliest Sumerian communities, Eridu, Nippur, weren't the chaotic sprawl of a people learning to exist together. They were structured, organized, oriented with purpose that approaches the mysterious. When excavators first reached Eridu's foundations, they anticipated chaos. What they discovered instead was stratum upon stratum of building. Each temple was reconstructed directly atop the previous, reaching back nearly 8,000 years. The most ancient structures weren't crude trials. They were already advanced, oriented to compass directions, constructed on elevated platforms to respect heavenly sightlines, encircled by waterways that flowed with designed accuracy. The settlement of Ur, location of the renowned ziggurat, displays the same troubling pattern. Its pathways were arranged in networks. Its barriers were enormous, strengthened with bitumen and baked brick, materials requiring sophisticated ovens and understanding of chemistry. Dwellings had sewage systems. Open spaces faced the heavens in calculated proportions. Even the positioning of entrances followed astronomical orientations, as though the constructors were charting the skies onto the ground itself. Nippur, Sumer's central hub, occupied the middle of a network of settlements arranged in distances matching musical proportions and heavenly patterns. Archaeologists have observed that the spacing between major Sumerian communities reflects the same base, 60 proportions employed in their mathematics, as if the entire civilization had been arranged rather than built. This wasn't a coincidence. It was construction that recalled something. And then there is the tongue itself. Sumerian exists alone in human speech history. It has no identified relatives, no linguistic forebears, no developmental path leading backward into simpler versions. It surfaces in the archaeological evidence completely developed, intricate, accurate, and inexplicably separated. Linguists have devoted over 100 years attempting to link Sumerian to other language groups. They've examined it against Indo-European, Semitic, Dravidian, even Uralic languages. Nothing matches. It exists beyond the language tree completely, as though it had been moved from somewhere or someone else. To compose in Sumerian was to work with a framework that merged sound, symbol, and significance in ways that feel almost programmed. Each cuneiform mark could signify a term, a sound unit, or a concept depending on setting. The structure was agglutinative, constructing significance through stacked endings in designs requiring remarkable linguistic complexity. The Sumerians themselves held that their writing originated from an ancient source of understanding. They didn't claim to create it. They stated it was provided. And the more we examine their tablets, the more difficult it becomes to dispute otherwise, because the substance of those tablets discloses something even more peculiar than the tongue itself, understanding that shouldn't yet exist. One clay tablet found in Nippur's remains documents Venus's orbital pattern with remarkable precision, 584 days, matching contemporary astronomical findings. Another tablet maps Jupiter's and Saturn's movements, following their locations across decades with accuracy, requiring multi-generational documentation and mathematical frameworks we connect with much later civilizations. Star charts carved into cylinder stamps display constellations we still identify today, the bovine, the arachnid, the feline. But they also contain heavenly references suggesting the Sumerians were watching not merely the visible heavens, but patterns within patterns, precessional movements taking thousands of years to finish. How could an earliest civilization follow cosmic time on that magnitude? And then there is mathematics. The Sumerians employed a base, 60 numerical framework, sexagesimal counting, which creates the invisible structure of our contemporary existence. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a round shape. These aren't random. They're Sumerian. Base. 60 permits, elegant separation. It has more divisors than base 10, making it perfect for celestial science, shape study, and commerce. But it's also a framework requiring conceptual thinking, a comprehension of portions and proportions that most early peoples took hundreds of years to create. The Sumerians possessed it from the start. Tablets from the Old Babylonian era, inheritors of the Sumerians, disclose mathematical challenges involving Pythagorean number sets more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras existed. They figured square roots, resolved quadratic problems, and grasped geometric sequences. One tablet, designated Plimpton 322, contains number collections suggesting trigonometric understanding we didn't believe existed until the Greeks. Yet there it remains, carved in clay, quiet and waiting. The further the excavations proceeded, the more the oddities increased. Archaeologists unearthed proof of sophisticated metalworking, bronze mixtures requiring exact temperature management, and understanding of tin acquisition from distant trading networks. Implements that displayed no developmental growth, no experimentation phase, just sudden capability. They discovered medical writings describing surgical methods, pharmaceutical formulas using dozens of plant elements, and body knowledge suggesting dissection and organized study. One tablet catalogues symptoms and remedies for over a dozen ailments arranged with clinical accuracy. And everywhere throughout the remains there was structure, administrative documentation, levy receipts, land contracts, temple stock lists, wage records for laborers. The type of governmental intricacy requires not merely literacy, but organizational memory, frameworks passed down and refined across generations. But where were those generations? Where was the clumsy start, the uncertain first attempts, the gradual ascent from stone to bronze to iron? The Sumerian evidence displays none of that. It starts already moving, already advanced, already recalling. The settlements themselves seem to reflect this. In Uruk, underneath the magnificent temples, excavators discovered more ancient structures, and underneath those, more ancient still, each stratum more sophisticated than the one above it, as though civilization was shrinking rather than growing, becoming smaller, plainer, more forgetful as it moved ahead through time. It's the opposite of what we anticipate, and it corresponds perfectly with what the Sumerians themselves recorded, that leadership, understanding, and structure came from elsewhere. Whether they meant advanced teachers, instructors, or survivors of forgotten people who endured some ancient disaster, their terms point to one unmistakable concept. Sumer received civilization. It didn't generate it. The clay doesn't deceive. It recalls. And what it recalls is an existence that came earlier, an existence that was constructed in straight paths, counted in the 60s, followed the celestial bodies across thousands of years, and left behind not wreckage, but reverberations. Reverberations kept in the structure of settlements, in the separation of tongue, in the accuracy of mathematics, and in the troubling advancement of a people who surfaced in history already conscious. The mystery that lingers in the quietness between those clay tablets is not how the Sumerians accomplished so much. It's who instructed them to recall. Among the thousands of tablets scattered across museum holdings and archaeological locations, one record exists apart, not because it is bigger or more decorated, but because of what it dares to assert. It is termed the Sumerian King List, and it interprets it as a record of impossibility. The tablet starts with a solitary phrase carved in the same wedge-pressed cuneiform employed for grain counts and commerce receipts. After the leadership came, the leadership was in Eridu. What comes next is a catalogue of monarchs, titles, settlements, reign durations, reaching backward through time until the figures themselves separate into something that no longer seems human. 8 monarchs are identified, 8 rulers who controlled the existence before the deluge, and their reigns aren't calculated in decades or even hundreds of years. They're calculated in tens of thousands of years. Alulum, the initial monarch, governed for 28,800 years. Alaunga, the second, for 36,000 years. Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. Continuously the catalogue proceeds, each title matched with a settlement: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larag, Sipar, Shurapak, and each reign impossibly extended, as though time itself functioned under different principles. In sum, these 8 pre-deluge monarchs controlled for 241,200 years. Then the tablet documents a solitary sharp sentence. Then the deluge swept over. And following that phrase, everything transforms. The reigns contract. Death returns. The monarchs who come after the deluge rule for hundreds of years, then decades, then lifespans identifiably human. The era of legends yields to the era of mortals. The impossible becomes the historical. The legendary collapses into the ordinary. But the shift is smooth. The king list doesn't separate the two periods in manner or design. It handles both with the same administrative accuracy, as though documenting not imagination, but recollection. And that is what troubles researchers most, because the Sumerian king list wasn't composed as legend. It wasn't a song or a verse meant to motivate worship. It was an administrative record carved in the same cuneiform writing employed for levy documentation, temple stock lists, and grain receipts. It was duplicated and reduplicated across hundreds of years, with each writer handling it as authoritative history. The settlements identified in the catalogue are genuine. Eridu, the initial settlement, has been excavated. Its remains reach back nearly 8,000 years. Stratum upon stratum of temples constructed and reconstructed in the same location. Shurapak, location to the deluge champion Ziusadra, has been verified. Larag and Sipar, both genuine, both archaeologically confirmed. These weren't imaginary locations. They were the foundations of a civilization that maintained documentation obsessively, that prized accuracy, that recorded everything from heavenly body movement to labor compensation. So why would they catalogue monarchs who controlled for 36,000 years? Some researchers reject the figures completely, terming them exaggerations meant to provide legitimacy to subsequent rulers. Others view them as writing mistakes gathered through hundreds of years of duplicating. But neither clarification accounts for the uniformity. Multiple editions of the king list endure, from Nippur, from Lhasa, from Isin, and while specifics differ, the organization remains identical. 8 monarchs, impossibly extended reigns, then the deluge, then death. It's too calculated to be a coincidence. And then there are those who observe mathematics. The figures in the king list aren't haphazard. They follow a design. Nearly all of the pre-deluge reigns are multiples of 3,600, a measurement the Sumerians termed the Sar. In their understanding, the Sar signified not merely a duration of time, but a heavenly pattern, the interval it required for certain planetary orientations to return to their beginning locations. Alulum's reign, 28,800 years, equals 8 years. Alaunga's reign, 36,000 years, equals 10 stars. Enmenluana's reign, 43,200 years, equals 12 years. The design repeats. The figures aren't lifespans. They're astronomical symbols, epochs marked by the rotation of the skies rather than the pulse of human existence. To researchers who view the king list through this perspective, the pre-deluge monarchs weren't individuals. They were representations, protectors of heavenly ages, personifications of planetary patterns, delegates of periods so immense that only the celestial bodies could calculate them. Maybe leadership coming from elsewhere wasn't figurative at all, but a declaration of cosmic structure, a framework where rulers were selected not by bloodline, but by orientation with the heavens itself. But even this understanding raises a mystery that hovers over the entire record. Why would an administrative culture program celestial science into their royal bloodline? Unless they held that the two were inseparable. Unless they viewed time, leadership, and heavenly motion as a solitary woven strand, one that had been broken by the deluge and had to be recalled, kept, passed down in clay so it would never be forgotten once more. Because to the Sumerians, the king list was not a metaphor. It was history. They held that these monarchs existed. They held the reigns were genuine, even if the magnitude challenged human understanding. And they held the deluge that concluded that age was not an account created to clarify suffering. It was a recollection of an actual disaster, one so immense it reset civilization's timepiece itself. The deluge didn't wipe away my imagination. It wiped away recollection. And everything that came after, every settlement, every temple, every cuneiform mark pressed into moist clay, was an effort to retrieve what had been erased, to reconstruct not merely civilization, but remembrance. The king list is a record of endurance, a way of stating, this is what we were, this is what we originated from, this is what the deluge removed. And maybe that is why the figures feel so incorrect to us. Because they aren't meant to calculate time the way we do. They're meant to calculate erasure, the space between what was and what stays, the opening between the era when understanding came from elsewhere and the era when humanity had to acquire everything once more, gradually, painfully, from pieces. When you hold that strain between the administrative accuracy of the king list and the cosmic impossibility of its figures, you start to comprehend why the Sumerians duplicated it so attentively, why they handled it as authoritative, why they declined to modify the reigns into something more credible. Because to alter the figures would be to forget, and forgetting, to them, was the only genuine ending. The deluge had already removed one existence. The clay tablets were their promise that it would not remove the recollection of that existence as well. So the king list stays pressed into clay, quiet and waiting, a documentation of 8 monarchs who controlled before the waters arrived, whose titles still bear the burden of periods we can no longer picture, and whose reigns mark the limit between the existence we recognize and the existence that drowned. And just past that limit, underneath the ascending waters of the deluge, rests the mystery that lingers in every phrase of the king list. If these monarchs were genuine, what type of existence did they control? The solution rests buried underneath 10 feet of sediment. When archaeologists first reached the further strata of ancient Sumerian settlements, they anticipated continuity, one civilization flowing into the following, stratum upon stratum of habitation marking the gradual movement of time. What they discovered instead was disruption, a barren band of deposit, pure, consistent, empty of pottery pieces, cinder, or human trace. A deluge layer. The excavation crew directed by Sir Leonard Woolley during the 1920s excavated through temple and dwelling remains until their implements struck clay. Dense, water-deposited clay that reached down 8 feet before touching the charred remnants of a more ancient community underneath. Woolley stood in the excavation and understood he was examining the physical limit between two existences. Underneath the sediment, scorched barriers, broken pottery, the remains of a settlement that had concluded in flames. Above the sediment, fresh foundations, reconstructed temples, a civilization ascending once more from quietness. The identical design surfaced at Shurapak, Ziusadra's settlement, the deluge champion. Underneath the remains, a stratum of sediment. And at Kish, another band of deposit marking the identical violent disruption. The chronologies differed slightly, around 2900 BCE, but the communication was unmistakable. Something had swept over the territory. The Sumerian tablets describe it with bare plainness. Then the deluge swept over. No expansion, no spectacle, merely a solitary phrase separating history into before and following, the era of legends and the era of mortals, the existence of impossible reigns and the existence of death. And that plainness, originating from a people that documented everything in thorough detail, seems more like witness declaration than legend, because the Sumerians didn't compose the deluge as metaphor. They composed it as documentation, as recollection, as the instant when the ancient existence drowned and the fresh one started, smaller and more delicate, but resolved to recall what had been erased. The most ancient account originates from a tablet found in Nippur, composed in Sumerian hundreds of years before other ancient texts. For 7 days and 7 nights, the deluge swept over the territory. The enormous vessel was thrown about by the windstorms on the immense waters. The champion of this account is Ziusudra, whose title means Life of Extended Days, or He Who Discovered Life. In the Akkadian tradition, he has another name, but the organization remains steady across all accounts. A man cautioned by an ancient source of wisdom, a vessel constructed in secrecy, a torrent that wipes away the existence, and an endurance that keeps not merely life, but understanding. According to the tablets, an ancient source of wisdom, the keeper of knowledge and principles of civilization, came to Ziusudra in a vision, or maybe through the barrier of a reed shelter, speaking so others would not detect. A gathering had resolved to conclude humanity. The clamor of mortals had become too immense. The existence had become unbalanced. The command was absolute. But this source of wisdom could not endure to witness understanding vanish with the people who bore it. So Ziusudra was cautioned. He was directed to construct a vessel, to close it with bitumen, to transport aboard the origin of all existing things, not merely animals, but artisans, melody makers, writers, the keepers of recollection, the carriers of knowledge. Abandon wealth and pursue life. Reject possessions and keep the spirit living. When the rains arrived, they didn't cease. The tablets state the tempest raged for 7 days. The immense vessel was thrown upon waters, so immense they blanketed the ranges. The existence underneath, temples, settlements, fields, everything vanished underneath the churning darkness. And then quietness. When the waters withdrew, Ziusudra released a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. The raven didn't return. It had discovered territory. The vessel came to settle on a range, and Ziusudra made a contribution of gratitude. He became recollection itself, the existing declaration to what had been erased. But here is the mystery that archaeology will not permit to settle. Was this an account, or the reverberation of a genuine endurance? Because the geological evidence proposes something occurred. Across Mesopotamia, strata of deluge sediment mark a sudden disastrous inundation around the identical interval the king list positions the torrent. Core specimens from the Black Sea disclose a dramatic ascent in water amounts roughly 7,500 years ago, when meltwater from withdrawing ice sheets broke through natural obstacles and drowned immense coastal territories in a matter of weeks. The conclusion of the final ice epoch, around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, wasn't gradual. It was marked by violent climate movements, glacial lake explosions, and rapidly ascending seas. Coastlines that had been located to human communities for thousands of years were submerged. River valleys became seas. The islands vanished, and humanity scattered across those coasts would have watched the waters ascend. They would have escaped inland. They would have bore what they could, implements, origins, accounts, and they would have recalled. Because a deluge that wipes away your existence is not something you forget. It becomes the separating phrase in your history, the instant when everything transforms. Deluge legends surface in nearly every ancient people. Various ancient texts describe floods. People across different civilizations tell similar stories. How could civilizations separated by seas and thousands of years all recall the identical disaster? Maybe because it wasn't one deluge, but many regional disasters caused by the identical global climate movement, each one devastating enough to burn itself into collective recollection. Or maybe, as some investigators propose, there was a solitary enormous occurrence, A comet strike, a glacial collapse, a break so immense it reshaped coastlines worldwide and became the deluge that all peoples recall. The Sumerians held the latter. They held the deluge was not regional. It was complete. It wiped away the ancient existence, the existence of the pre-deluge monarchs, the existence where understanding came from elsewhere, the existence of impossible reigns and heavenly structure. And when the waters ultimately withdrew, what stayed was quietness. The advanced civilization pulled back. The monarchs became mortal. The settlements had to be reconstructed from pieces. And the survivors, people like Ziusudra, were assigned with the most important duty imaginable: to recall, to bear ahead the origin of all existing things. Yes, but also the origin of all understanding things. The mathematics, the star maps, the healing, the tongue, the principles, the knowledge that once flowed freely. That is why the Sumerian tablets seem so pressing. Why the king list was duplicated and reduplicated across hundreds of years. Why their settlements were reconstructed on the wreckage of more ancient settlements, each one a reverberation of what came earlier. Because they weren't creating civilization. They were rebuilding it. And the deluge, the immense quietness that separated their history, was the reason why. Following the quietness came the instructors. When the deluge waters withdrew and the survivors appeared into an existence made peculiar by absence, they were not alone. According to the tablets, there were advanced beings who stayed or returned to assist humanity recall what had been erased. The Sumerians termed them the Anunnaki. The title itself bears the burden. Those who came from elsewhere. Not figuratively, not symbolically, but as a designation as accurate as any bloodline or position documented in their administrative writings. And what exists immediately apparent, what makes these figures different from legends of subsequent times, is that they weren't described as all-powerful. They weren't remote, unknowable powers residing past mortal reach. They were contributors, designers, constructors, rule-givers, instructors who walked among humanity and shared the understanding required to reconstruct. The tablets describe them with peculiar detail. Enki, associated with the deep waters and keeper of knowledge, instructed humanity in farming, water management, and the healing practices. He was the one who cautioned Ziusudra of the deluge, who could not endure to witness understanding vanish. His representation was the serpent, signifying wisdom and renewal, and his territory was Eridu, the initial settlement, where the most ancient temples in Mesopotamia still ascend from the sand. Enlil, associated with air and tempests, controlled law and structure. He was the executive power among the advanced beings, the one who commanded the deluge and subsequently provided leadership to mortals. His temple at Nippur was regarded as the center of the existence, the location where sky and ground linked. To control without this approval was to control unlawfully. Anu, associated with the highest skies, was the father of the pantheon, remote but foundational. His title surfaces in star maps, and his temple in Uruk was oriented to heavenly occurrences. He signified the cosmic structure itself, the framework within which all understanding existed. And there were others. Ninhursag, the mother figure who formed life from clay. Inanna, associated with affection and conflict, whose travels between sky and the underworld became metaphors for recurring ending and renewal. Utu, associated with the sun, who transported illumination and fairness. But here is what separates the Anunnaki from legend. They were not revered as conceptual ideals. They were recorded, their bloodlines documented, their settlements identified, their interactions with humanity kept in thorough detail, as though writers were recording history, not creating tales. The most troubling of these documents describes humanity's creation itself. In the writing designated the Atrahasis epic, the advanced beings become weary of toil. They have constructed settlements, excavated waterways, elevated temples, but the labor is endless. And so they conceive a resolution: to generate entities who will bear the load in their location. Enki and Ninhursag are assigned with the labor. They take clay from the ground, the primordial mud of creation, and combine it with something else. The tablets state it was the essence of an advanced being, a special quality sacrificed to provide humanity intelligence and spirit. From the essence, let a spirit stay. Let it be declared as an existing mark. Let the spirit stay so it is not forgotten. The clay is formed. The special essence is combined in. And from that joining, humanity is born. Part ground, part advanced, mortal in body, but bearing within them a spark of something more. To contemporary interpreters, this sounds like figurative language. But examine the terminology. Combining essence, moving spirit, generating entities from raw material and received symbols, clay and essence, body and blueprint. It interprets less like verse and more like a description of genetic design, the deliberate creation of life through the joining of two origins, one material, one informational. Researchers reject this as legendary symbolism, a way for ancient people to clarify their own existence. But the Sumerians were not a people given to unclear metaphors. They recorded grain shipments and star locations with the identical clinical accuracy they employed to describe these beings. When they realized that humanity was made from ground and advanced essence, they may have been documenting the only way they understood how to describe something they witnessed or received recollection of, but couldn't completely clarify. During the 1970s, investigator Zakaria Sitchin proposed a controversial understanding, that the Anunnaki were not mythological at all, but extraterrestrial visitors who arrived to Earth in pursuit of resources, genetically designed humanity as a labor power, and left behind the recollection of their existence in our legends. Mainstream researchers rejected this interpretation nearly universally. The proof, they contended, didn't support literal visitation. The Anunnaki were archetypes, anthropomorphized natural powers, heavenly bodies personified, or deified forebears whose accomplishments became legendary across time. And yet, the descriptions linger. The Anunnaki were stated to be radiant, winged, coming down in flame, moving between sky and ground in vessels the Sumerians couldn't identify but attempted desperately to show. Cylindrical items, fiery chariots, sky vessels that gleamed like lapis lazuli and bronze. Cylinder stamps from Uruk display winged figures standing beside what seem to be heavenly diagrams, planetary orbits, stellar orientations, geometric designs that resemble nothing in the natural existence but everything in the territory of sophisticated celestial science. And these identical descriptions, entities of illumination coming down from elsewhere, instructing forbidden understanding, surface across peoples separated by seas and thousands of years. Various ancient traditions share similar stories. How could such uniformity appear independently? Maybe because they weren't independent. Maybe because the recollection of the Anunnaki, or whoever they were, was more ancient than the deluge. A recollection borne by survivors who scattered to remote shores and reconstructed their civilizations in separation, each one keeping pieces of the identical original account. Or maybe the Anunnaki were not visitors from the celestial bodies, but survivors of a pre-deluge civilization, a sophisticated people that possessed understanding we have only recently rediscovered, and who appeared from the disaster to instruct the remnants of humanity how to start once more. A vanished people whose technology seemed so far past the understanding of deluge survivors that they could only be described as legends. We may never understand. But what the tablets make evident, what the Sumerians repeated across thousands of years of documentation, is this: civilization was not created. It was provided. Humanity didn't stumble into farming, celestial science, writing, and law through experimentation and mistakes. We were instructed by entities who originated from somewhere else, whether from advanced regions, across the sea, or from the drowned existence before the deluge. The function of humanity, to the Sumerians, was not to generate. It was to recall, to keep the understanding entrusted to us, to bear the principles of civilization ahead through time so they would not be erased once more. The Anunnaki provided humanity with the implements, the laws, the tongue, the star maps, the construction, and then, according to the tablets, they pulled back. Not completely, but enough. The era of direct communion concluded. The advanced beings became remote. The monarchs became mortal, and humanity was left with the assignment of maintaining what had been passed down, the inheritance of a forgotten existence, programmed in clay, kept in ritual, and spoken through the extended quietness of history. And so the mystery stays, lingering in every cuneiform mark pressed into moist clay. What type of entities were the Anunnaki? And if they genuinely originated from elsewhere, where did they proceed when they departed? But understanding is not only kept in accounts. Sometimes it hides in equations. Buried among the songs and the legendary accounts of deluge and creation, archaeologists discovered something unexpected: technical manuals. Records with no legendary preamble, merely pure, distilled understanding. Metallurgical equations specifying copper-to-tin proportions for bronze mixtures. Architectural calculations employing geometric proportions. Medical writings cataloguing pharmaceutical elements with dosage directions. Agricultural schedules oriented to heavenly occurrences. And astronomical figures of such accuracy that contemporary scientists had to double verify them with computer frameworks before accepting they were genuine. These were not the compositions of a civilization acquired through trial. They were the compositions of a civilization. One tablet found in Nippur's remains, catalogued as 4924, documents Venus's synodic pattern with perfect precision, 584 days. This is the duration it requires for Venus to return to the identical location relative to Earth and the Sun, a calculation requiring multigenerational watching, advanced mathematics, and implements capable of following planetary motion with remarkable uniformity. The ancient Greeks would not precisely map Venus for another 2,000 years. European celestial scientists wouldn't verify the pattern until the Renaissance, armed with telescopes and hundreds of years of gathered information. Yet here it was, pressed into clay, accurate and waiting, as though the Sumerians had merely duplicated it from a more ancient origin. Other tablets document Jupiter's, Saturn's, and Mars's orbits. They follow lunar stages, solar eclipses, and the precession of the equinoxes, a wobble in Earth's axis requiring 25,920 years to finish a complete pattern. To watch the precession requires not merely one lifetime of watching the celestial bodies, but generations upon generations of information passed down and meticulously kept. How could the earliest civilization already possess this understanding unless they were not the earliest? And then there is mathematics. During the 1940s, archaeologists examining tablets from the old Babylonian era, inheritors of the Sumerians, discovered a clay piece now designated Plimpton 322. At initial glance, it seemed to be a catalogue of figures, but upon closer examination, mathematicians understood it held Pythagorean triple sets, collections of three figures that satisfy the formula A superscript 2 plus B superscript 2 equals C superscript 2. This was more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras existed. The tablet wasn't instructing the concept. It was employing it, utilizing it as an implement for resolving intricate geometric challenges, figuring land calculations, and creating architectural angles. The understanding was already embedded, already assumed, as though whoever carved those figures had received a framework so sophisticated that they were no longer required to clarify its origins. Another tablet describes figuring square roots, employing an iterative method nearly identical to contemporary algorithms. Others display a comprehension of exponential increase, compound interest, and geometric sequences, concepts that wouldn't resurface in Western mathematics until the labor of medieval Arab researchers and Renaissance Europeans. The Sumerians were not finding these principles. They were employing them, as though the equations had been passed down complete, waiting only to be utilized. And it wasn't merely conceptual understanding. The physical items tell the identical peculiar account. In Uar's and Eridu's remains, excavators discovered bronze implements perfectly molded, alloyed with accurate proportions of copper and tin, chronologically placed to intervals that predate the so-called Bronze Age in the territory. The shift from stone to bronze is meant to signify hundreds of years of gradual advancement, gradual sophistication, experimentation, and mistakes. But the Sumerian bronze displays no such development. It surfaces suddenly, already optimized, as though the understanding of metalworking had been moved rather than created. Cylinder stamps from Uruk show what seem to be mechanical apparatus: wheels, gears, pulleys, items that seem too sophisticated for their supposed technological setting. Some stamps display figures operating what resemble looms or drills, machinery that suggests a comprehension of torque, leverage, and accuracy designing. And then there is the item that declines to match any chronology at all: the Baghdad battery. Found in 1936 near Kujut Robu, just outside Baghdad, the object consists of a clay container, a copper cylinder, and an iron rod, elements that, when filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or wine, can produce a small electrical current. Chronologically placed to around 250 BCE, it occupies awkwardly in the Parthian interval, a time when no one is meant to have grasped electrochemistry. Some investigators propose it was employed for electroplating gold onto jewelry. Others contend it was a ritual item with no functional intention. But the creation is unmistakable. A primitive battery built 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta would create the contemporary edition in 1800. Could the Parthians have stumbled upon this by coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe they too were receiving pieces of understanding that reached back further than anyone wanted to confess. Because the location where the battery was discovered occupies a top strata of more ancient habitation: Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian. Each person constructed on the wreckage of the one earlier, each one keeping reverberations of what had been erased. The further you excavate, the more ancient the understanding becomes, and the more it seems like inheritance rather than creation. The Sumerians had a term for this type of understanding: me. It's often interpreted as principle or ordnance. But the significance is more accurate than that. They were not laws or regulations. They were symbols, principles, equations embedded into the fabric of creation itself. Understanding that controlled not merely human civilization, but the organization of reality. There were stated to be over 100 men, each one signifying a different aspect of existence: leadership, priesthood, melody, metalworking, writing, conflict, fairness, sexual affection, decision-making. To possess me was to possess the blueprint of civilization. And according to the legends, the men were not created by mortals. They were maintained by Enki, and could only be passed to humanity through transfer, or occasionally through clever theft. In one account, Inanna travels to Eridu and tricks Enki into providing her the me while he is intoxicated. She loads them onto her vessel and sails back to Uruk, transporting civilization with her. Enki, understanding what he's accomplished, attempts to retrieve them, but Inanna has already crossed the limit. The understanding is released. It's a peculiar legend, but it bears within it a more ancient truth. Understanding is moved, not generated. It exists somewhere, in some original version, and civilizations ascend or decline based on their capability to access, keep, and transmit it. Maybe that is what the Sumerians were attempting to tell us, that the science in their tablets, the celestial science, the mathematics, the metalworking, was not the result of gradual finding. It was the result of recalling, of retrieving what the deluge had nearly wiped away, of assembling pieces of a framework that had once been whole. The survivors of the torrent didn't start from zero. They started from wreckage. and within those wreckage were inscriptions, implements, star maps, equations, enough to reconstruct, if only they could recall what the representations meant. Maybe what we term advancement is only this, the gradual, painful process of recalling what we once understood. And maybe the Sumerians, ascending from the deluge with clay still moist in their hands, grasped this better than we ever will. That civilization is not constructed, it is rebuilt. That science is not created, it is retrieved. And that every equation pressed into clay, every star map oriented to the skies, every bronze implement molded in flame, is not a triumph of human creativity, but a monument to endurance, a way of stating, this is what we preserved. This is what the deluge didn't remove. But there is one mystery deeper than the science, more ancient than the settlements, more inexplicable than the deluge itself. The tongue, Sumerian, exists alone in human speech history. Not figuratively alone, not poetically separated, but linguistically orphaned. A tongue with no identified relatives, no ancestral roots, no developmental path leading backward into simpler versions. For over 100 years, linguists have attempted to link Sumerian to other language groups. They've examined it against Indo-European, the immense family including English, Greek, Sanskrit, and Persian. Nothing. They've compared it to Semitic tongues like Akkadian and Hebrew, which subsequently dominated the identical territory. No match. They've pursued connections to Dravidian languages of India, Uralic tongues of Central Asia, even Basque, another linguistic orphan. Every effort concludes in quietness. Sumerian doesn't match. It exists beyond the language tree completely, as though it had fallen from somewhere else, or ascended from something much more ancient. It surfaces in archaeological evidence around 3500 BCE, already completely developed. Intricate structure, advanced vocabulary, a writing framework so accurate it could document verse, law, healing, and celestial science with equal clarity. There is no Proto-Sumerian, no transitional phase, no proof of development. It merely is. And then, just as suddenly, it vanishes. By 2000 BCE, Sumerian was no longer a spoken tongue. It endured only as a ceremonial language employed in temples, kept by writers, and examined the way Latin would be examined hundreds of years subsequently in medieval Europe. A deceased tongue maintained living through ritual, because to forget it completely would be to break the final link to the ancient knowledge. But even in the end, Sumerian continued to linger in the territory. Akkadian writers acquired it. Babylonian priests recited it. Assyrian monarchs inscribed it on their monuments. For 2000 years after it ceased being spoken, it stayed the tongue of recollection, the language in which the most ancient truths were documented, because to the Sumerians, their tongue was not a human creation. It was inherited knowledge. The tablets state that writing originated from an ancient source, associated with understanding, grain, and accounting. The title means, "She who counts the celestial bodies," an epithet linking literacy with celestial science, documentation with heavenly watching, as though tongue itself were a version of cosmic calculation. This was not associated with verse-makers or account-tellers, but with writers, those who kept, figured, and transmitted understanding. To compose in Sumerian was to participate in this labor. It was an act of keeping, not generation. And the writing framework itself reflects that intention. Cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, was not an alphabet in the contemporary meaning. It was something more ancient, more stratified. Each mark could signify a sound, a term, or an entire concept, depending on setting. A solitary wedge-shaped mark could be a sound unit in one writing and a representation in another. The marks were structured: triangles, phrases, angles, forms pressed into moist clay with a reed stylus. And yet within that structure, something else was programmed. Some researchers have observed that Sumerian cuneiform marks often mirror natural versions. The mark for range resembles peaks. The mark for water resembles flowing waves. The mark for the celestial body is an asterisk radiating illumination. It was as though the writing were not merely signifying reality, but mirroring it, capturing the form of things at the level of essence. To compose in Sumerian was to perform an act of duplication, an effort to trap ancient speech in clay before it faded into quietness. The Sumerians didn't hold their tongue. They held they were recalling it, retrieving something that had been provided to them from elsewhere, or from earlier. And there is proof, peculiar and subtle, that proposes they might have been correct. During the 1970s, linguists examining Sumerian songs started observing something unusual: mathematical proportions embedded in the organization of the verses. The quantity of sound units per phrase, the repetition of certain sounds, the spacing of stressed and unstressed beats, all of it followed designs corresponding to harmonic proportions in melody. Not coincidentally, not approximately, accurately. The songs were arranged employing proportions like 2:3, 3:4, and 4:5, the identical proportions defining musical consonants, the identical proportions the Sumerians employed to tune their lyres and harps, the identical proportions they embedded in their construction and celestial maps. It was as though tongue, melody, and mathematics were not separate disciplines, but expressions of a solitary unified framework, a symbol governing sound, significance, and figure simultaneously. Some investigators have proposed this reflects an ancient comprehension of reality as vibrational, that the Sumerians held the universe itself was organized by harmonic principles, and that tongue was the human effort to resonate with that organization. To speak correctly was to orient oneself with the cosmic structure. To compose was to program that orientation into clay. The term the Sumerians employed for this type of understanding was me, the principles we encountered earlier. But me also bore connotations of sound, vibration, and utterance. Advanced beings didn't merely think creation into existence. They spoke it. And the me were the terms they employed, the primal sound units that formed reality. If that is accurate, then Sumerian may not have been a tongue in the way we grasp tongue today. It may have been something closer to a programming tongue, a structure created to interface with the fundamental organization of existence itself. And if the deluge scattered humanity and separated tongues, as subsequent accounts would assert, then Sumerian may have been the final surviving piece of the original tongue, the pre-deluge language, the speech of existence before the waters arrived. There is a phrase in ancient texts, "And the whole ground was of one tongue and of one speech. Before the scattering, before the confusion of tongues, one tongue." The Sumerians never termed their tongue Sumerian. That is a contemporary designation. They termed it Emezal, which translates roughly as the noble tongue or the princely language, a title suggesting it was not merely functional but elevated, set apart. And maybe it was. Maybe before the deluge there was a solitary tongue spoken by the pre-deluge monarchs, instructed by the Anunnaki, programmed into the me, a tongue where sound, significance, and mathematics were unified, a tongue that could describe not merely items and actions, but the relationships between things, the proportions governing version, the vibrations organizing matter. And maybe when the deluge arrived and the ancient existence drowned, that tongue was erased, except for pieces kept by survivors like Ziusudra, passed down through generations, attentively inscribed into clay so it would not be forgotten completely. By the time the Sumerians surface in history, the tongue is already ancient, already fragmented. They don't speak it fluently. They reconstruct it the way archaeologists reconstruct pottery from pieces. They compose it down obsessively because they understand it is fading. They instruct it in temple schools because they sense that to lose it completely would be to lose the final bridge to existence earlier. And they were correct. When Sumerian ultimately ended as a spoken tongue, something irretrievable was erased. A way of thinking, a way of programming reality, a link to the structure that could never quite be retrieved in any other language. Various ancient philosophies would subsequently speak of organizing principles of the cosmos. But the Sumerians had understood this earlier. They had understood that tongue was not haphazard, that it was not created by humans fumbling toward communication. It was provided, coming from elsewhere, organized by the identical proportions governing the celestial bodies, the proportions of melody, and the proportions of temples. And when we interpret their tablets now, quiet, waiting, resting in museum glass, we are not merely interpreting terms. We are interpreting the final reverberations of a unified symbol of creation. A tongue that once bridged sky and ground. A language that advanced beings themselves had spoken. And if we listen closely enough, between the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, we can nearly hear it still, gentle, structured, singing in proportions we no longer grasp. But tongue was not the only bridge. Extended following the deluge, extended following the ancient existence had been consumed by water and quietness. Humanity attempted to reconstruct what had been erased, not through terms alone, but through stone. They constructed towers, enormous tiered structures ascending from Mesopotamia's plains like ranges that had no right to exist in that flat, endless landscape. The Sumerians termed them ziggurats, from the Akkadian zigguratу, meaning to construct high, and they dotted Sumer's settlements like stairways frozen mid-ascent. You are possessed one. Uruk possessed one. Eridu, the initial settlement, possessed one ascending from the most ancient location in Mesopotamia. But the greatest of them all, the one that would reverberate through history and legend for thousands of years, existed in Babylon. They termed it Etemenanke, the house of the foundation of sky and ground. It was not a temple in the way we think of temples. It was not a location for reverence alone. It was a structure of link, an effort to anchor the skies to the ground, to generate a physical point where different realms could meet once more. Because to the Sumerians, that link had been broken. The deluge had not only drowned the ancient existence, it had broken the connection between sky and ground. The advanced civilization had pulled back. The direct communion that once existed, when understanding came down freely, when leadership originated from elsewhere, when the Anunnaki walked among mortals, had faded into recollection. And so humanity was constructed, not out of pride, not out of resistance, out of yearning. The ziggurats were not stairways to the sky, as subsequent interpreters would assert. They were landing locations for coming down, platforms built to invite the return of advanced knowledge. Each level signified a heavenly sphere, a stratum of the cosmos. Each tier was painted a different shade, black for Saturn, white for Jupiter, red for Mars, gold for the Sun, mirroring the visible planets as they surfaced in the night heavens. At the summit of each ziggurat was a small temple, a chamber open to the celestial bodies, furnished with a bed, a table, and contributions of food and drink. Not for priests, for returning knowledge. In case they returned. In case they came down once more, as the tablets stated they had before the deluge, and discovered a location prepared for them. The structure itself was a chart of the cosmos. The foundation signified the earthly territory, solid and square, oriented to the compass directions. Each ascending tier symbolized a higher sky, a stratum of reality closer to the advanced origin. And at the top, at the meeting point of ground and heavens, was the chamber, the location where sky contacted ground. To exist at the foundation of a ziggurat and look upward was to witness the universe rendered in construction. To ascend it was to climb through the strata of creation, moving from mortal ground toward the territory of advanced knowledge. But the ascent was not meant for everyone. Only priests could climb. Only those trained in the practices, the songs sung in the ancient tongue, the equations opening doorways between existences. They would ascend the external stairways, 3 or 4 flights, ascending along the outer barriers, bearing contributions, chanting, performing rituals created to summon the knowledge back. But the connection didn't return. Or if it did, it arrived rarely, quietly, in visions and dreams, no longer in the radiant physical version the ancient tablets described. The era of direct communion was finished, and the ziggurat, despite its grandeur, despite its accuracy, despite the thousands of laborers and decades of building poured into its making, became a monument to absence, a structure pointing towards something no longer present. Etemenanke, the greatest of all ziggurats, ascended nearly 300 feet into the heavens. 7 tiers, each one painted, each one oriented, each one programmed with astronomical and legendary significance. It was visible for miles across the flat Babylonian plain, a man-made range in a territory where no ranges existed. The Greek historian Herodotus visited it in the 5th century BCE and described it in wonder, terming it a tower of immense magnitude, constructed in phases, with a spiral path ascending to the summit. He said that at the top was a temple with a great bed and a golden table where, according to the priests, advanced knowledge would come down and settle. But even in Herodotus's time, the ritual was ancient, a relic, a recollection of something that had once been genuine but was now only reenacted, performed in the hope that the ancient link might somehow be rebuilt. And then there is the account that would arrive subsequently, the one that would reframe Etemenanke not as yearning but as arrogance, the Tower of Babel. In ancient texts, the account is brief. Humanity, speaking one tongue, gathers in the plain of Shinar, Sumer, and resolves to construct a tower reaching to the skies. Advanced forces, witnessing this, become alarmed. Behold, they are one people, and they possess all one tongue. And this is only the start of what they will accomplish. And nothing they propose to accomplish will now be impossible for them. And so the tongues are confused. Suddenly, the constructors cannot grasp one another. The labor halts. The tower is abandoned. Humanity scatters across the ground, separated not merely by space but by speech. The account is told as a cautionary tale, a caution against pride, against the arrogance of attempting to reach the sky through human effort. But that is not how the Sumerians told it. To them, the tower was not an act of resistance. It was an act of remembrance, a desperate effort to reconstruct what the deluge had destroyed. Not merely settlements and temples, but the bridge itself, the link between the mortal and advanced, the connection that had once permitted understanding to come down freely, that had made humanity partners in creation rather than servants abandoned in the wreckage. The confusion of tongues was not punishment. It was a tragedy. The erasure of the unified tongue, maybe the original Sumerian, the Emezal, the language bearing me, was not a command meant to humble mortals. It was the final breaking, the instant when the final strand linking humanity to the pre-deluge existence snapped. Following Babel, there was no solitary tongue that could program the proportions, no solitary language resonating with the organization of the cosmos. There were only pieces, dialects, scattered terms that once created a whole but now bore only fragments of significance. And without that unified tongue, the tower couldn't be finished. Not because humans lacked the designing skill, they had constructed ziggurats for hundreds of years, but because the tower's intention was not construction. It was communicative. It was meant to be a beacon, a signal, a point of resonance that would summon the knowledge back. And without the tongue to program that summons, the structure was merely stone, empty, quiet, pointing toward a sky that no longer responded. From that quietness, history started. Not the history of the pre-deluge existence where monarchs controlled for tens of thousands of years and understanding came from elsewhere, but the history we identify with. Fragmented, separated, mortal, nations speaking different tongues, people separated by language obstacles, civilizations ascending and declining, each one attempting to recall what had been erased, but no longer capable to share that recollection across the spaces. The ziggurats stayed, scattered across Mesopotamia, gradually weathering under breeze and rain. The priests continued their rituals, ascending the tiers, arranging contributions, singing songs in a deceased tongue to knowledge that no longer came down. And Etemenanke, the house of the foundation of sky and ground, existed quiet in Babylon, its summit open to the celestial bodies, its chambers empty, its stairways leading nowhere. A monument not to human pride, but to human yearning. A structure that attempted desperately to recall what it was like when sky and ground were not separated, when advanced beings walked underneath and mortals could hear their voices, when there was one tongue, one understanding, one bridge linking all things. But the bridge was broken, and all that stayed were the towers reaching upward into quietness, waiting for a coming down that would never arrive. The desert breeze passes over Iraq in the hours before sunrise, bearing powder that may have once been temples. From above, from satellite perspective, from the quiet orbit of contemporary watching, Mesopotamia resembles a palimpsest, strata upon strata of civilization pressed into the ground, each one dim, each one waiting. Urux remains barely ascend above the sand. Eridu rests underneath excavation coverings. Uar's ziggurat captures moonlight on its reconstructed tiers, a ghost of structure in an empty plain. In museums across existence, behind temperature-managed glass, the clay tablets settle. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, each one a piece of recollection pressed into mud and baked hard by time. Cuneiform marks still visible, still readable, still speaking in a tongue no one speaks anymore. And somewhere in the quietness between those marks, in the space between what was composed and what was erased, a mystery hovers. What existence existed before the deluge? Because everything we have pursued, every oddity, every impossible figure, every fragment of received understanding, points to the identical troubling conclusion. The Sumerians were not the start. They stated so themselves. In clay, in stone, in the attentive structure of their settlements, they termed themselves the restorers of what was earlier. Not the creators, not the pioneers, the restorers. Their tongue surfaced completely developed, with no forebears to follow. Their mathematics arrived complete, with proportions and equations that would not be rediscovered for thousands of years. Their celestial science followed patterns requiring generational watching, yet they possessed it from the beginning. Their settlements ascended structurally oriented, construction advanced, as though someone had passed them a blueprint, and their own documentation, administrative, accurate, obsessively detailed, described an existence before the deluge. An existence of impossible monarchs and advanced instructors. An existence where understanding came from elsewhere and humanity was instructed rather than left to fumble in shadows. If we accept them at their term, if we interpret the tablets not as legend but as declaration, then the picture emerging is not civilization's origin. It is the twilight of a more ancient one. And the deluge, the immense disaster separating their history into before and following, was not the dawn of human advancement. It was the instant when an earlier existence drowned, and the survivors, clutching pieces of what had been erased, started the extended, painful labor of recalling. For hundreds of years, researchers rejected this as legend, metaphor, the primitive effort of ancient people to clarify their origins through accounts of legends and deluges. But then the proof started to gather. Geological surveys across Mesopotamia disclosed strata of deluge sediment, pure, barren deposits placed suddenly, separating charred settlements from reconstructed ones. Core specimens from the Black Sea displayed a dramatic inundation roughly 7,500 years ago, when ascending meltwater breached natural obstacles and drowned immense coastal territories in a matter of weeks. Satellite scans and sonar charting revealed submerged wreckage off the coasts of India, Japan, the Mediterranean, megalithic structures, stone rounds. Construction remains resting underneath hundreds of feet of seawater, drowned when the ice epoch concluded and the seas ascended. and the chronology started to orient. 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, the planet underwent disastrous climate movements. Ice sheets collapsed. Sea amounts ascended by over 400 feet. Coastlines that had been located to human communities for thousands of years vanished underneath the waves. If there were civilizations on those coasts, sophisticated, structured, possessing understanding of celestial science and construction, they would have been wiped away nearly completely. Only those who escaped inland, who bore what they could, who recalled what had been erased, would have endured, and those survivors would have told accounts of an immense deluge, of an existence that drowned, of advanced beings who once walked among mortals but pulled back following the waters arrived, of understanding that had to be kept, programmed, passed down so it would not vanish completely. The Sumerians may have been the descendants of those survivors, not the earliest civilization, but the earliest reconstructors, the ones who took the pieces, the star maps, the mathematical equations, the construction principles, the ancient tongue, and pressed them into clay so they would endure, so the recollection would not end. And if that is accurate, then everything we term civilization's origin is actually the final reverberation of something far more ancient. The pyramids of Egypt, the megaliths of Malta, the temples of Göbekli Tepe, 11,000 years old, predating Sumer, constructed by people who were meant to be hunter-gatherers, yet somehow possessed the structure and skill to move stones weighing dozens of tons. These are not starts. They are conclusions, the final monumental efforts of an existence that understood it was fading, that constructed in stone because stone would outlast recollection, that programmed understanding into structure because terms would be forgotten. The Sumerians grasped this. That is why they composed so obsessively, why they duplicated and reduplicated the king list, the deluge account, the songs, why they constructed ziggurats as landing locations for knowledge that no longer arrived. Why did they keep a deceased tongue for 2,000 years after it ceased being spoken? Because they understood what it meant to lose everything. They had received the recollection of that erasure. The deluge was not ancient history to them. It was an existing trauma, passed down through generations, programmed into their identity. They were the children of survivors, the keepers of pieces, the ones assigned with making certain the existence earlier would not be completely forgotten. And they succeeded. For 5,000 years, their tablets have endured. Their settlements, though buried, have been excavated. Their tongue, though deceased, has been deciphered. Their star maps match our findings. Their mathematics informs our timepieces. Their deluge account reverberates in every person on earth. They kept the recollection. But the caution embedded in that keeping is evident. Every era ultimately forgets. Civilizations ascend. They gather understanding, construct monuments, program wisdom into frameworks they hold will last forever. And then, through conflict, through disaster, through the gradual weathering of time, they decline, and the understanding is erased. Not all of it, but enough. Enough that the following civilization has to start over, assembling pieces, mistaking rebuilding for creation, terming advancement what is really just remembrance. We are not immune to this pattern. Our own understanding is delicate, stored in versions that decay, in frameworks requiring maintenance, in tongues and symbols future generations may not grasp. If the power networks failed, if the satellites fell, if the servers went dark, how much would endure? What would we leave behind for those who arrived following? Maybe clay tablets were wiser than we understood. Plain, enduring, readable by anyone willing to acquire the forms, a technology of keeping outlasting kingdoms. The Sumerians were not primitive. They were survivors of something we are only starting to grasp, and their communication, pressed into clay and buried underneath ziggurat wreckage, is this. Recall. Recall that what you construct can be erased. That understanding is not permanent. That every deluge, whether of water, flame, or time, resets the existence, and only those who have programmed recollection into something enduring will possess the chance to reconstruct. The following deluge is always approaching. Maybe it will be a climate collapse. Maybe nuclear conflict. Maybe the gradual forgetting arrives when civilizations become too intricate, too fragmented, too reliant on frameworks no one completely grasps. But it will arrive. And when it does, the survivors, if there are survivors, will look back at our wreckage the way we look back at Sumer. They will excavate through our settlements, decipher our tongues, wonder how we understood so much and why we didn't listen. They will discover our satellites fallen to ground, our information centers quiet, our monuments weathered. And if we are wise, they will also discover something else. Something enduring. Something programmed. Something stating, this is the rebuilding of what was earlier. Because in conclusion, that is all any civilization can accomplish. Keep what matters. Pass it ahead. Trust that someone, somewhere, in some remote era, will discover it and grasp it. The desert breeze passes over Iraq in the hours before sunrise, bearing powder that may have once been temples. And underneath that powder, underneath the wreckage, underneath the deluge sediment and the charred settlements and the quiet ziggurats, the recollection waits. Patient, structured, pressed into clay, still speaking in the shadows.